I am very excited to welcome into the show today Dale Whitaker. And Dale is someone whom I've been following for a while now, and in fact have been talking largely in uh, largely in kind of cryptic terms, the same stuff he's been talking about. On many podcasts, I've talked about what he's been talking about for over a year now. And Dale has inside knowledge and the courage to name names. I haven't done that. I think you will really love this episode. I think it's very important for anyone who owns gold and especially IRAs. Dale, welcome to the show, my man. Glad you're here.
Andy, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, Dale. For those people who don't know what you're all about, what your mission is, you've recently stepped into the spotlight by exposing what you call deeply unethical practices. I would say it's far deeper than deep. It's some of the worst things I've ever seen in my career. In fact, probably the worst things I've ever seen in my career. And these practices are in the gold and precious metals industry, obviously. But for those unfamiliar with your story, what led you to blow the whistle, and what's your mission now in coming forward?
I'll start with the second question first because it's easy. My mission is to destroy the segment of the industry that is doing these to folks and defrauding folks of their retirement. It's that simple. By whatever means necessary, to me, saving people's life savings is the most important thing. And that's also kind of what led me to blow the whistle. What led to that point was a series of events. I detail it in my book, but I like people to be able to get this information without having to buy or read my book if they need to. I've had prior interviews where I've gone into depth about this, but there was a series of events starting with my assistant at the time bringing up some questionable markups and so on our coins. And at the time, I was kind of like dismissive, like, hey, it's willing buyer, willing seller. The client buys it from us at X dollars and we have a spread, and then we buy it back for Y dollars. It's very simple. But that isn't the case. What led to me realizing what was happening was I worked remotely here from my home in Washington, and our offices were down in Culver City in California. The CEO, Isaac Nuriani, called me and he asked me to manipulate the spread on a 5,000 coin buyback, silver coins. A client wanted to sell back 5,000 of our exclusive premium coins to us. So he calls me and he says, hey, we have a client that wants to sell back 5,000 coins. And I'm like, okay, great. What's the client's name? I'll draft the PO. Simple, right? Your spread calculation is very easy. And he says, well, I don't want to pay that much, so I want you to increase the spread, which means we would pay the client less. And in that moment, I realized what the deal was. I realized what was happening. And I refused. I said, nope, I'm not going to do that. And I remember the day very, very well, very vividly. And I remember Isaac's mannerisms were on Skype. And he kind of tilted his head and he chuckled. And then he realized that I was being dead serious, that I wasn't going to manipulate the spread. And he goes, wait, you're serious? And I said, absolutely. I was like, we have an agreement with our clients that our spread is 29%, which, as you know, is a ridiculous spread in the first place. So we're going to pay back 29%. 29%. We're going to pay them back at their spread at 29%. And he's like, oh, all right, my man. Well, just change it. What's the big deal? And I really think this was him testing me to see how far I would go or if I would even go there. And I said, no. I said, I'm not doing it. And I just said, you know what? You do what you want to do, but you leave me out of it. And my wife was working from home. My wife was not working at the time, and I worked from home. So my office was in our basement. So I ran upstairs. She was in the kitchen making lunch, and I was just like, something is terribly wrong. Like, something is wrong. And I was just flush with adrenaline. And at that point, I was like, I don't know what to do. So then I just started researching, what do I do? I finally got in contact with, so my first thought was, well, I just need to tell people. So if I can get the information in the right hands and so on. So I started talking to journalists, and one of the journalists that I was talking to suggested that I contact a whistleblower attorney and that I actually blow the whistle. And I'd never heard of this thing. So then I started researching. And she actually referred, she had helped another client that had blown the whistle write their book, and she referred me to the same firm that her client had used on her expose as well. So I reached out to them, James Hoyer, law firm out of Florida, and we drafted our whistleblower complaint and filed it with the CFTC.
I mean, I, for one, thank you. And I mean, God bless you is about the only thing that I think is appropriate, because you're right. Something is very, very wrong with that model. I've had people come up to me at a conference, one old man who came up to me crying and said, my wife is in the audience. If she finds out what you just talked about, that I'm the person, the victim, I talked about this on stage in Canada. And he was hysterically crying and said, I'm going to lose. She's going to leave me. This is all we have. The stuff that I have seen, you can't even make up. And I'm trying to be honest about this as I can without divulging names or anything like that. But I went on a whole series of shows and started talking about this because I want people to know that it is as bad or far worse than what Dale is leading onto. Dale, you had mentioned off air that when you left, you were somewhere around $40 million that the company had done at 30+% markups. Is that right?
It's way worse than that, actually. So we scaled. So I was the second in the door. There was another gentleman that was there before me. His name was Jeffrey Ward. So I think, if you don't mind, I'll start from the very beginning. So Isaac Nuriani, the CEO of Augusta Precious Metals, worked for a company called Merit Financial. Merit Financial were sued by the city of Santa Monica, city of Santa Monica, for fraud, deceptive sales practices, and so on. And in fact, Isaac was named in one of the lawsuits against Merit Financial, and then he was subsequently dropped because he was under the corporation, and so on and so on. So some legalese there, but that was what it was. So when that happened, Isaac actually left the company during this time and started Augusta Precious Metals with his savings that he'd accumulated from being one of the top salesmen at Merit. Now, Merit Financial were doing like $200 million a year, so they were big time. They were doing a large amounts of revenue with the same exact model. Now, Isaac started Augusta Precious Metals, and he wanted to start scaling, so he started hiring off of Craigslist. Essentially, he hired a guy named Jeffrey Ward, who was subsequently sued for $76 million by in a joint lawsuit from the CFTC and the SEC with a company called Red Rock Secured and a guy named Shay Johnson Kelly. I have pictures of myself with these guys at my wedding. I know these guys, right? Like, I worked with them side by side. They were at my wedding. And so the corruption has been ongoing. I mean, this lawsuit was filed in 2012, and it was brought to a conclusion in 2014 when Merit had to shut their doors. So Isaac had started, he brought on Jeff, and then he brought on myself. And then when Merit Financial closed, Shade Johnson Kelly, who later started Red Rock Secure and was sued into the ground, showed up on Isaac's store because he worked a couple of blocks from Merit's HQ. The guys showed up to Merit. There was a notice on the door that said, hey, we're closed. See you later. Good luck. The guys went over to Augusta with Merit's leads in hand. They stole the lead database, and they went to Augusta and said, hey, man, we don't have a job. Are you ready to go with Augusta? Because they knew, like, he was good friends with Shay Johnson Kelly, so they knew that he was starting Augusta. And Isaac just converted his living room into basically a boiler room sales floor. And they took the Merit leads and they start cold calling leads, and it kind of blew up from there. So we went from doing, like maybe a few $100,000 in 2014 to in 2016, 17 doing like $42-45 million in gross revenue with about a 15 to 20% net profit margin, which, as you know, in the precious metal space, that net profit margin just does not exist.
5 or 6 times what we make.
Yep.
At 15%, we'll do $700 or $800 million in sales. That's the only way you stay in business, is to be competitive at 2%. 2.5%, it would be great if you can get it after all the expenses and shipping that you pay for. And it's 1% or less typically. I'm sorry, keep going, please.
Yeah. So no, you're fine, and you're exactly right. I think that contrast is really important. Now, I was not in the precious metals space before this. I was a freelance accountant at the time. I was picking up gig work, and I was doing like, I'd take a client's full year stuff, and I'd sit down, and over an 8-hour period, I'd crank out financial statements. That was kind of my gig at the time. And so the way that I happened upon Augusta was just through doing gig work. Then I got offered a full-time position there, which I subsequently took. And there were some things, I guess, over the years where, red flags, hindsight 2020, things that when put together cumulatively make it so obvious that this was happening. But because I was here in Washington State and the headquarters were down there, I didn't really get direct access to the sales floor. I didn't see the dynamic of the sales floor and how the salesmen closed sales, how the salesmen interacted with customers, and so on. And the way that they do this is a lot of it's fear mongering. A lot of it is honestly just brute force. And they kind of use what I call the car dealership method. If anyone's ever bought a new car and you go to a car dealership and they keep you there all day, right? And they kind of break you down over time and try and sell you these packages and all this other thing. They kind of do the same thing where a client will be on the phone and they'll start building rapport with them. And sales can take days instead of just being like, hey, I want to buy gold American Eagles. And, here we are and we're done, right? Out the door. Very simple. Well, they don't do that. They start building a relationship and building trust with clients so that later on they can exploit that trust. And so over time, as I've seen these things in kind of in a vacuum, and then the realization hits that they're manipulating the spread, which is where the real fraud happens. I realized, oh crap, these guys really are taking people's retirements en masse. So
one of the things that you've said so far is what I had assumed, and it puts that puzzle piece firmly in place. When I've been talking about this on other shows, Sarah Westall, Kyle Seraphan, both shows you've been on, Beyond Mystic, talked about it with Adam Taggart, Robert Kiyosaki, all sorts of people. We've talked about this. And what you said to me is very interesting, that merit ceased to exist and it filtered down to Red Rock and to Augusta. When I'm on these shows, I say something without mentioning names. And the interesting thing is that every single one of these companies, and there's a few you haven't mentioned yet, they all do the same thing. They all do the same thing, and that is they sell quarter-ounce gold coins at typically, like between 1,000. Well, now that it's I was saying this when it was 2,000 an ounce, but it's, they'll sell it at huge spreads above, but they're always quarter-ounce gold coins from mints that you've heard of, but the design you've never heard of. They're coins you've never heard of, like a quarter-ounce grizzly bear from the Royal Canadian Mint. Well, they don't make a quarter-ounce grizzly bear unless it's a special edition. They call it a special edition, in other words. So what I'm assuming these companies do is they go to the Royal Canadian Mint or to the Perth Mint or the Mint in the UK, and they will strike a deal to buy a mold or create a die, make their own coins that they have exclusivity to, and then they call it special or whatnot. And the same thing is true with silver, always somewhere between 1/2 ounce and 1.5 ounce at massive premiums. But what I'm getting at is that you have 5 or 6 companies and they all do the same thing. Every one of them.
It's more than 5 or 6. There's a lot. And there's actually even ones that pop up and I am like, who are these guys, right? And so what's really important to understand is that this dichotomy of this Augusta being birthed from Merit and then Red Rock being birthed from Augusta, this happens all the time. This is consistently what happens because the salesmen that are smart enough to understand that the money isn't in the sales, the money is in owning the company, will create their little cliques. As sales teams, you know how this works, right? Sales teams have like kind of cliques, people they prefer. They build these cliques. Then they go, hey, why are we selling for this guy and making this guy a multimillionaire when we can just go start our own company and we can be the multimillionaires? That's exactly, greed is what fuels this whole thing. I mean, Shade Johnson Kelly was making $650,000 as the vice president of Augusta, working 30 hours a week. That's more than doctor money. He would otherwise be flipping burgers at McDonald's. He has no other credentialing. He has nothing. I mean, he's a smart guy. I mean, I don't think necessarily education makes you smart. He's a smart guy, but the reality is he has no other background in anything other than sales. So, but what salesman makes $650,000 a year, right? It was
Well,
ludicrous money.
and I want people to understand from my perspective, this is flat out white collar crime. One of the reasons that I left Miles Franklin in Minnesota, I live in Delray Beach. My office is in Boca. The reason I moved to Florida, um, or the reason when I moved to Florida, that I left my corporate office in Minnesota. We've had a satellite office down here in Florida for almost 20 years. And I left Minnesota during the George Floyd riots and came down here. The reason I didn't bring my company with me is that Minnesota is the only state in America that regulates what is a federally non-regulated industry. And so we are held to a much higher standard. Most of companies, including all of those, would never do business in Minnesota. They would have to be licensed, bonded, and background checked every year. But I want people to understand that what these people are doing is flat out white collar crime. So let's walk me through. You talked a little bit about it, but I think this is some people who may think that they were involved in this with some of the companies. They should really listen to this question, and that is, how does, I'm going to call it the scam because it is a scam. How does it actually work? How are investors being misled? Where's the real money being made at their expense?
Right. So the overall answer to your question is it's complicated. So I'm going to try and boil it down the best way I can. So you call, let's say I have $250,000 in my IRA, and I call and I get qualified. They qualify you, right? They make it sound prestigious. I'm going to qualify you, and
Yeah.
So they have this air of prestige. We're the premier gold company, and so on, which and I know that it just doesn't exist, right? You get levels of service, different businesses as you would any other business. And so they give this aura of prestige. They qualify you. So you'll call in and you'll talk to what's called a junior sales account executive, or a junior AE is what we call them, account executive. They would pre-qualify you, and they'd be working directly under a senior account executive who is like the good salesman. The junior's learning from the senior. So you have this dynamic. Now, the junior will earn part of the commission that the senior earns if they're able to sell you these exclusive premium coins. So you call and you probably want gold American Eagles or gold Canadian Maple Leafs, Krugerrands, whatever it may be. You would just want common bullion that you've heard Andy or whoever talk about, and you're just looking to invest. So they'll go through the entire sales process, Andy, that you're probably familiar with, right? They'll get the funding through the custodian. They'll make sure that the funds are with the custodian and so on. And then what they'll do is they'll tell the person, hey, we'll sell you your gold Eagles, this is our price. And they go, okay. So then the customer will then initiate the transaction with the custodian to send the funding to Augusta. And then what will happen is they will get a call from the salesman and say, hey, I want to tell you about this other coin that I think is better for you in your portfolio. I think this coin is going to be a lot better for you. It performs better over time, and so on and so on and so on. And then they start hyping up this coin, and then the customer might be a little skeptical. And this is where the car dealership method comes in, that I was talking about earlier, where they will wear you down over time. They will talk to you for hours and hours and hours. And in one instance, what I witnessed was absolutely crazy in hindsight. A client was not on board at all. They did not want the coin. And what they would call these people, by the way, it was a derogatory term that they would use, is a bully head, bullion, bully. So if you weren't interested at all in the premium coin, they would call you a bully head. So if someone placed a trade and the person, the salesman called me, for example, and we were talking about a specific customer, if that customer would not buy these coins that they wanted to sell them, that they'd make all the commission off of, they would be like, oh yeah, he's a bully head, just sell him whatever and move on. So you'd call in and they'd wear you down over time. Now, you have to remember that at the time, Augusta were paying 0% commission on the American Eagles and Krugerrands and any bullion products, but selling, at one point, our commission was 15% on the exclusive premium coins. So if I'm a salesman, the only incentive I have to sell you anything is to sell you the exclusive premium coins. I have zero incentive to sell you the bullion. And in fact, this became such a contentious problem because when they couldn't flip, what they would call flip someone, right? It's like a bait and switch. You couldn't flip them into the premium coins. They would the salesman would be pissed. They'd go to Isaac and they'd say, hey, like, this is $500,000. I worked on this client for 3 days and I just couldn't get him to flip, blah, blah, blah. So we actually ended up at one point starting to pay like a percent or a 1.5 on bullion. And so there was a direct incentive, but even still, I mean, you're talking 15% versus 1%, and that's without bonuses. There were commission structured bonuses. So if you had earned $5,000, so not sold $5,000 in product, but if you had earned $5,000 in commission, you get a small bonus like $250, and then 10,000 you'd get 500, 20,000 you'd get like a $5,000 bonus. It was crazy. Like, the incentive structure was completely centered around these coins. So a lot of people, and I'm sure you've witnessed this, like with that gentleman that you were talking about earlier, they when I'm talking to them, they say, I'm so embarrassed. I'm embarrassed. And I've seen many highly intelligent people, like people with PhDs, that were swindled. And a lot of this is because it's a big con game. It is a massive con game. I mean, these guys are the best at what they do. They could sell you your shoes. They could take your shoes off your feet and sell them to you, and then make you thank them for the privilege of doing it. I mean, they're really good. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. And so I hear a lot of people when I talk about this, well, how dumb do you have to be and so on? It's not that. It's so much more than that. These people build trust and then they exploit the trust. And then there's the influencer side of it that comes into this too, where you have a large portion of the conservative influencers out there who are also building trust with their viewers and then exploiting that trust by advertising for companies that do this as well. So you have this massive dynamic, right? Like, this does not exist in a vacuum. These things are all intentionally set up to build trust and then exploit that trust when the time comes to execute the transaction. So like I said, it's very complicated, but in a nutshell, that's overall how it works. And I would just like to touch on one thing that you mentioned earlier about the mints, because you brought up the mints, and this is a very good point. So in I believe it was 2020, I sent a letter to the Royal Canadian Mint, and I sent a list of all the coins at that time that were being used in this exploitative way. And I got crickets, and they are still continuing to enter into these contracts to this day, because the Royal Canadian Mint, while it is a state mint, they are also allowed to execute private contracts as long as they're fulfilling their fiduciary duties to the government. So the way that works, if you don't mind, is I want to have an exclusive coin. So then I call a distributor. There's a specific distributor that everyone likes to use. And they call the distributor and they say, hey, I want to get a coin. And you prepay a certain amount of the premium. So if I want 250,000 coins, we paid $750,000 up front to get that premium coin. So we paid the premium up front to the distributor, who then obviously passed along the mint's portion to the mint. And then the way that the Royal Canadian Mint do it is they cannot mint any coins that cannot be distributed in Canada. So what they do is they mint the coins, and they mint like a small batch for Canada, like maybe 5,000 coins that they sell on their website or whatever and make available to the public in Canada. But then what they do with the United States market is they say, hey, you, Augusta Precious Metals, have the exclusive distribution rights to this coin in the United States. So no one else can enter into the primary market for that coin. Only Augusta can sell, for example, the silver Canadian half-ounce bald eagle, which is one of the first coin that I had helped broker for them with the distributor. And now you might say, well, why would they do a silver Canadian eagle? Well, they do a silver Canadian eagle because people who want to call and buy a silver American eagle, it's a very easy sell to say, oh, we have the silver Canadian eagle. It's a much nicer coin. It looks a lot nicer, whatever it may be. And so then Augusta, having that primary market and the sole ability to sell that coin in the US market, has control over two things: supply and demand. And as you know, Andy, the two major things in any economy are supply and demand. That's what controls pricing. So if I control the supply and I limit mintage to 250,000 coins, for example, and then I'm talking to my clients on the phone and I'm telling them, hey, we're only minting 250,000 of these, and this is also part of the reason why these coins are so expensive, then the client, understanding those two basic economic principles, will go, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. And they call them exclusive, premium, they hype them up, all that kind of stuff as well along the way. And so then they use the fractional denomination that, as you also touched on, which is to further confuse folks because it's really hard for folks to do quick math on the film when you're working in half ounce denominations or quarter ounce or 1.5 ounce. They do those too, 1.25 ounce, right? So they use these fractional denominations to further confuse folks when they're talking about the price on the film. And in fact, it's actually pretty complicated because, as you know, when you're doing these analysis for folks who have been scammed, the first thing that I do, and I actually developed a calculator on my website to do this for folks at dalewhitaker.com, just a short plug. But if you go to dalewhitaker.com, there's a calculator on there that you can use to see if you've been swindled. And what that calculator does is it basically converts everything to 1 ounce denominations so that we have a linear playing field. So we can say, okay, if you had bought 1 ounce bullion coins at the same time, assuming a 10% premium, which is somewhat high sometimes, but just assume a 10% premium, this is how many more ounces you could have purchased had you not have purchased these other coins. So we do this conversion to get everything on a level playing field. And it's amazing how much value is lost just in that. And, folks, like you said, the folks don't realize it, and part of that is because these guys will tell them, you need to hold on to these assets for 5 to 10 years in order for you to see a result. It's like, well, no crap. Of course you have to, because you guys took 50% of my value off the top.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd like to mention, just pull on a couple strings. You talk about, they call them premium coins. So we have a very robust relationship with the Royal Canadian Mint, and we have storage facilities in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal for the last 15 years. And I've been to the RCM, and we have many RCM business associates that we call almost borderline friends. And along the way, we built a 2 ounce coin on the Canadian Rocky Mountains, right? We designed it. Same thing that you're talking about. And we sell them for less than the silver maple leaf. We don't call it a premier coin just because we control it and control the spot. Actually, the supply and the demand. We want people to have a better deal on it, and so we are able to sell it for less than the regular maple leaf, because one of the things that's important for people to understand is that demand really on any of these oddball coins. And one of the things the Royal Canadian Mint will not let you do is to do something that is what you can't make your own silver maple leaf with a different design on it. It has to be something completely different. The point of it is that when these people call us and say, yeah, I got these half ounce Canadian bald eagles, what's it worth? It's never going to be worth for any other dealer in the United States more than 99% of melt value, because there is no demand for that stuff anywhere. They create an artificial synthetic demand. So if I were to buy $1 million worth of those from someone who was defrauded, help them get out of it, they would sit on my shelf collecting dust. No one's going to buy them. And so it's the cost of carry. So we just melt them down and do whatever with them. Point of it is, they are not premier at all, and in fact are anything but that. I'm glad that you explained that. That's a big deal. People should understand that.